Good morning. My name is Richard Wexler, and this is Caring in America, the podcast for caregivers and care recipients. So, as I always do on every episode, a little background. Who am I and why am I doing this? So, 18, almost 19 years now, go back to the summer of 05, I'm working in the software industry, minding my own business, got married later, two small children at that time, 11 and 7, and we start getting phone calls. Adds up to 4 phone calls, one from each one of our parents. They're now exceptionally ill. My wife and I, like most couples, had done no planning. We are about to start a journey that will change our lives. That journey went on for 14 years until the last parent passed at 96 in 2019. Led me about 16, 17 years ago to the formation of my company, Points of Life, and educating people about this little word called care. And then last year in the spring, decided to start this podcast so we could reach out to even more people. We have a special guest today. His name is Robert Drake. I'm going to introduce him. He is an interfaith chaplain, a life coach, and a grief counselor who now operates Drake Living and Dying Design on his 6-acre farm on Washington's Olympic Peninsula. He was originally trained as a philosopher, has a Master of Science degree in philosophy and conflict resolution, and a Master's of Divinity with experience as a hospital, hospice, and palliative care, spiritual care provider, and grief counselor. We will call him Bob today. Bob, are you there?
I am, Richard. Good morning.
Good morning to you. So tell our audience where you're speaking from.
Pleasure to be here and an honor. I am situated right now on, as Richard said, our 6-acre farm on the Olympic Peninsula, which is also connected to Puget Sound, which goes all the way from Olympia, Washington, up to Seattle and beyond into Canada.
Wow.
So I'm speaking from the kitchen and cat next to me, and really glad to be here.
Well, welcome. We're going to talk about a tough subject. You know, I talk so much about planning before someone gets ill, before someone falls, or a combination of both happen. I think our last episode, I was talking about that again, really trying to get our audience and the people they talk to understand how important that is. But I kind of have a general question for you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess there probably needs to be planning for end of life as well. Am I correct?
Yes, a really important topic. Unfortunately, most people do not plan. They're not even aware of what's called an advance directive for advanced care planning. And so what happens, especially with the elderly, is that planning doesn't happen until it's almost too late, until you're in the emergency room where most people in the end of their life get a good amount of their care, or if it's that from there into the intensive care unit. So what's important is to plan ahead, let people know, your loved ones, your physician, your healthcare providers, what it is you want, what it is you don't want. And it's really important to be very specific. And there are some wonderful tools available to help people do that.
Very interesting. And so from what I'm getting, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I keep talking about planning before there is an illness or a fall. It sounds like this is equally as important because, and folks, I'm being honest. I mean, the last time I checked, at some point, we're all going to pass. So from what I'm hearing from you, Bob, it is extremely important.
It is extremely important, especially if you have a desire to die kind of the way you lived, with your values respected, with your philosophy, with your faith tradition, with the way you wanted to live your life, that you are allowed to die in that way as well. And things come up like advancing dementia, early onset dementia, and the important thing is that once we start to lose our capacities for whatever reason, whether it's some quick catastrophic event, car accident to a stroke or something like that, or if it's something like a really debilitating chronic disease or dementia, some type of neurological disorder.
Wow. So I totally understand and totally agree with you, and even though it is a tough subject, we need to get ahead of it, which kind of leads me to, and I want you to kind of talk broadly about this changes you've seen. I mean, it seems like, maybe I'm wrong, and you can correct me if I am, for years and years and years, the whole idea was you buy a plot, hopefully in advance, maybe not in advance. When someone dies, there's a funeral, someone is buried in that plot, and that's what we do. I mean, have you seen, and I know you've been in this business for quite a while, have you seen a lot of changes and different ways to think both about dying and eventually death?
Yeah. I think the big change has started the Civil War, when embalming came into common practice. And kind of from that point on, especially with the development of the funeral industry, funeral care providers really kind of took over dying, and rather dictated what was going to happen to us, to our bodies, et cetera, after we die. Nowadays, there are home funerals. There has been a strong move towards cremation. The amount of chemicals that go into the environment from the embalming procedure, a completely unnatural type of event. But cremation also, it's people are doing it a lot more and more and more. But there are drawbacks to that, and there are other changes, even to the point of having your funeral at home. There's in most places in the United States, you don't have to, for instance, move your loved one's body out of the house immediately. You can keep a person. I actually happen to be trained as a home funeral guide as well. It's just fine to hang on to your loved one for a little while and do ritual and have your family around and allow people to complete. And you can transport your loved one yourself. This all doesn't have to be handled and dictated by the funeral industry. And now there's even a move towards human composting. It's taking place more and more, really moving into the industry. So there are lots of options, but the really important thing, Richard, is to start having conversations earlier. We're in our culture, we have been so afraid. It's been just really hard to have conversations and about what we want at the end of our lives. And death has been the greatest bugaboo, as it were. And so these conversations generally, and of course this depends on your culture within the larger culture, but these conversations don't happen until it's too late in most cases. So the big move now in emergency rooms and in family practice, et cetera, is to start having advanced care planning early with your loved ones, with your healthcare providers.
That's something interesting. I had never really heard about a home funeral, didn't really know what you've told our audience of actually having some sort of ceremony there, being able to keep the individual there. That's extremely interesting. And one thing you're talking about that you've kind of said this, and I've seen it on your website doing some research on you, this idea of plan the dying you want. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'll use myself as an example. For me, I love being out of doors. One of the things I love about living on this farm is all the work, all the time I get to spend outside in the elements and with the creatures and the eagles and the bees and everything. And the planned dying is to really to plan so that you can die the way you live. I've recently put up a large tent so that people, with respect to, for instance, medical aid in dying, another way to plan for dying if you are terminally ill, if you qualify in the states for medical aid in dying, it's another form of planning. What what do I want my death to be like? Who do I want to be present? What do I want to have happen? When do I not want interventions? Do I want to be put on a ventilator, for instance, if something happens? Do I want cardiopulmonary resuscitation and perhaps having my ribs broken when I'm, during this process and then having to live or die rather, what in the time that's left of me in a hospital as opposed to at home? If I have dementia and I get to the point where I can no longer recognize my loved ones, or I can, I don't have the perceived dignity. The people that know me have the dignity that I have, the dignity that I wanted my entire life, and I get pneumonia. Do I want antibiotics, or do I want the natural progression of dying to take place? So these are things that we need to start thinking about early and having these conversations with our loved ones, partly so that our loved ones are not left with the responsibility, the huge responsibility of deciding for me what should happen. So have the conversations early. And again, there are some great resources that I'm happy to recommend if we get to that appropriate spot in this interview.
I think
Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I think the key there that you just talked about, and for a lot of families, it's hard to have this conversation, just like it's hard to have the conversation about planning before an illness or a fall. But what you just said, you're the son, you're the daughter, something's happened, maybe mom or dad can't communicate anymore, and you have to make decisions for them. That has to be extremely difficult and emotional. And obviously, having a conversation like this with your older loved ones before something happens as to what they want and all the different aspects that you were talking about, I think I know it can make this point in their life and their eventual death a lot easier for the family members that are still left. I want to talk to you about Drake Living and Dying by Design, and also this property that you've bought. Talk more about the property, what you're doing, and some of the unique things that are happening there.
Thank you. I would love to do that. I wonder, though, if I might bring one more point relative to what we were just talking about with the advanced care planning.
Sure.
Something that I've seen over and over again in my work as a hospice and palliative care, spiritual care provider in the family in these times is the conflict that can arise. Families are complex systems, complex organisms, and there are very few families that everyone is aligned on all things, that all the kids have the same understanding about what mom or pop would want. And it can cause huge conflict if these wants are not made clear ahead of time. So I'll leave that. So Drake Living and Dying Design, it came about, my wife and I bought this property a few years ago up here, and lots of tall Douglas firs, and building a food forest, so really, the gardens were registered as a farm. And so the idea is to have it be a natural place that is conducive to introspection, to thought, to reflection, and to healing. So joining Living and Dying Design with my wife's business, Love and Greens, the farm aspect of it, is the idea is to make this wonderful place where people can come to prepare, to think about dying, to, in some cases, to actually die, for instance, if they are using medical aid in dying, if that's appropriate for them. And probably more than anything, just a place to come and work on their grief afterwards, or in some cases before, or if someone gets a really terrible diagnosis and they need to process that with support and guidance. We can do that here. It's within this really natural setting. So grief work, both individual, group processes, retreat, and that's the idea here.
If I can ask, and it may be a very broad question, I mean, where did this idea come from? I know all the past work you've done. Is this something that you and your wife had looked to do for a while? Where did the idea arise from?
Um, the idea arose when we found the property. This is my wife does different work than I do, although she's really good at. We work together with business coaching and life coaching, etc. But it arose really when we discovered this property, and I started feeling this property and what could happen here for healing for people. And that all, of course, grew out of years of watching people suffer and die or not deal with their grief afterwards. And the thing about grief is that it's nonlinear progression. Grief can come out of what seemingly feels like nowhere and just hit you like a hammer for an old loss, and then can go away again. It's not linear. It comes and goes. But what I have learned over the course of decades in the healthcare field and in my work as a chaplain is that grief needs to be processed. It isn't, if we don't work with it, it kind of festers. We learn to live with it in a way, but it can generate its own problems if it's undealt with, unprocessed, unappreciated, that are physical, emotional, psychological, etc. We can get sick. We can break relationships because we have unprocessed grief. So my thesis is, and this is also a book that I'm working on, you have to grieve to heal more thoroughly, and active grieving, not just letting it be there, but working with it intentionally, and then working through it into a healthier place so that one can really be present for the life that is left to them and really appreciate the importance of what we have lost. We grieve because we lost something valuable. It could be a way of life. It could be a job. It could be a child. It could be a parent. It could be a pet. It could be an understanding about the way the world was supposed to be. I'm thinking of PTSD and the trauma that can happen in war, or with a physical assault, or a miscarriage or an abortion, there are so many losses that we experience. And for the most part, we don't work with them, partly because sometimes it's not accepted to talk about those things in society. You're just supposed to get on with it. And in fact, that's not the way the human organism works if it needs to be healthy. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm really glad you brought up that subject. It's a very difficult subject, and I'm going to make a comment again. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my guess is most people don't really understand grief and understand that process, and don't understand how this loss, as you just talked about, and there's many ways to have loss, how this may affect them. And again, my guess is some people it's relatively easy, and some people it's quite difficult.
Yeah. I'm thinking, for instance, of someone living with a loved one who has dementia. You know, there's a saying that living with a loved one with dementia is living with the continuous presence of absence. And I've got one of my oldest, dearest friends, is in this situation, and he doesn't recognize me, and his wife has been really strong, et cetera. But watching her suffering and watching the suffering of so many patients and their families, um, it's it can be just devastating, and it really is helpful. And I would say that we owe it to ourselves to work with these things actively, if at all possible, and also if it's authentic to ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, to have someone like yourself to talk to and understand, I mean, that example that you gave, when someone has severe dementia, Alzheimer's, may not be able to recognize loved ones anymore, how difficult that is. And then we know there's different forms of dementia, and there could be violent outbursts and so on and so forth. That's a very difficult time in someone's life. And it's great knowing that there are folks like you out there, which brings me, do you work, I mean, if someone were to call you from other parts of the country, is that workable for you?
It absolutely is. Zoom is a wonderful tool. Zoom, especially over the last few years with the pandemic, Zoom has been used by palliative care teams, by hospitals, by hospices, by psychologists, therapists to work with people at a distance. And it really works. So, yes, I can take people here, I can work with people in the house, out on the land, or by telephone or by Zoom. And it's just an amazing tool that we are so lucky this video capability to be in someone's room with them, essentially, but at a distance and still privately.
That's excellent. And a lot of illnesses, they draw out, they take time. And again, and knowing most likely that this loved one is headed in this direction, having someone like you to work with and talk to, I have to believe, can make this a little easier. I know, and I believe, in the tagline to your business is living gracefully and leaving peacefully. And I would think that's something that most of us would definitely want.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do, if I can, Bob, as we get ready to wrap up, can you give out a phone number, give out a website, whatever you'd like to do so people can get in touch?
You bet. I'd be delighted to. And I'm also going to give you a couple other resources. Um, so, Drake Living and Dying Design, I can be reached at robert@drakeldd.com. The website is drakeldd.com. Phone number is 971-813-4357. So I can be reached. I will get back to you if you call or drop me an email. I did want to mention a couple other resources with respect to advanced care planning. There's a book written by Barbara Coombs Lee called Finish Strong, Putting Your Priorities First at Life's End. And I also want to recommend the resources available at the national nonprofit organization called Compassion and Choices. So if you go to compassionandchoices.org, you will find lots of end-of-life resources to help you understand diagnoses, questions you should ask when you go into a physician, advanced care planning tools, even with dementia, and state-by-state information on end-of-life choices, including medical aid in dying. Right. So there you go.
Thank you, sir. Folks, difficult topic, great information from Bob. Again, this whole idea of planning, also having someone to reach out to like Bob as you're going through this process with a loved one. So very, very important information. As I say on every episode, folks, reach out to me. You have a question, you have a comment, you're an expert in the industry, you'd like to be a guest. That email is eldered2023@gmail.com. So once again, I want to thank Bob for being here today, providing this great information. And folks, as I always say, until we talk again, have yourself an awesome day.